There's a lot riding against Assassin's Creed Black Flag having as stellar of a reputation as it does. Now that's not to say there's a lot that is actively bad about this game, but a lot of its core mechanics are middling at best. Its combat system feels like a rehashed, less polished version of the Arkham games. Its stealth can be satisfying, but also incredibly simple, and its parkour, while very functional, lacks either the mechanical depth of the earlier games or the visual splendor offered in Unity. Its pacing is also all over the place. Its tutorial is bloated and way too long, and the amount of tailing missions in the game is frankly ridiculous. None of this makes the game unplayable, but you'd expect it all to put the game in a similar place that, say, the Watch Dogs series is in. Games that are fun enough in the moment, but that are also quickly forgotten about after you put the controller down. Black Flag is anything but forgotten though. Even more than a decade later, it's still widely talked about, and a large segment of the AC community regards it as the absolute peak of the series. And I would argue that's due to three core aspects of the game that elevate the entire experience: the ship, the setting, and the story. The ship is the most immediately recognizable strength of the game, and the one I have the least to say about. Naval combat is the only mechanic in the game that really works, but man does it work well. It's just a really good, engaging challenge to have to weave the jackdaw around enemy fire, and to balance maximizing damage with maximizing protection. And then there's the aesthetic flares added to everything. The way smoke steams from a ship after the cannons are fired, or the way your crew cheers on after every successful hit. They're not cheering alone though. Brian Tyler's criminally underrated soundtrack adds excitement to every encounter. And yeah, it more or less channels Pirates of the Caribbean to the letter, but I'm not complaining. The otherwise forgettable combat becomes downright exhilarating when it's in the context of boarding an enemy ship for plunder. For how much AC4 does struggle with pacing out its gameplay, its naval combat serves as an excellent example of perfectly structuring challenge, satisfaction, and reward together. But this is only the first of three pillars. The Assassin's Creed series is not short on memorable settings, but Black Flag's 17th century Caribbean still manages to set itself apart from the rest. Gone is the monumental architecture of Venice or Constantinople, or the carefully constructed urban streets of New York and Boston. The settlements found in Black Flag sport a much more rugged, naturalistic aesthetic. And then there's the ocean itself, which creates an atmosphere no game in this series has been able to match. For how much Ubisoft advertises these games as being open-ended and allowing for player choice, Black Flag is really the only one that captured that liberating sense of adventure that has defined other open-world games. And it does this despite the fact that, under the surface, its open world really doesn't behave all that differently from 2's or Brotherhood's open worlds. Its map is still littered with icons and the same repeated side content. But, as Blackbeard reminds us,
all a big show.
The ambience of the ocean is so strong that you hardly ever notice you're just using it as a highway between two waypoints. It also helps that the side activities you're completing look like this. That adventurous spirit also partially carries over to the world's land areas. The added verticality to the natural terrain, as well as the unpredictability to how buildings are laid out, all contribute to making these areas feel more open-ended and untamed. It's not quite as suffocating of an atmosphere that the open ocean provides, but it's still engaging. Put simply, Jerusalem, Florence, and Rome all feel like lovingly crafted, beautiful sandboxes to appreciate from a distance. But the Caribbean Sea feels like a frontier. If freedom is the main gameplay appeal of the AC franchise, then it's also the central theme of its overarching narrative. The main setup for the story, after all, is a 2,000-year-long war between the freedom-loving assassins and the authoritarian Templars. Now, while AC1 actually has some really interesting and nuanced theming, The later entries in this series played this trope more or less by the numbers, which isn't a bad thing. The Ezio games are predictable, rah-rah stories about the righteous freedom fighters killing the right people for the sake of spreading freedom. It's more or less Star Wars, except with Italians. And I love it. Yeah, it's ridiculously simple and unnuanced, and more than a little anachronistic. I really don't think the average 15th century Byzantine was super interested in hearing about the importance of freedom, but hey, it's still cool. Still, after Revelations came out, and Ezio had given his 100th speech about freedom and liberty and more freedom, you could tell the writers wanted to add some nuance to this whole discussion. Assassin's Creed 3 wanted the player to question if maybe the authoritarians might have a point here and there. And Unity later went on a more meta discussion about political radicalism in general. But sandwiched between those games stands Black Flag, which, in my opinion, has the most compelling and interesting points the series has ever made about freedom. Black Flag is unique in being the only game in the series to feature two distinct groups, both purportedly fighting for freedom. The assassins are of course present, but they play a relatively minor role in the story up until the final act. In their place, there's the Pirates of Nassau, who at first appear to have the same ideology of the assassins. Before the Brotherhood is even properly introduced, Benjamin Hornigold is making statements that sound like they could have come right out of the mouth of Ezio.
Not a bad take today. Keep this up and Nassau will be the first city where men and women may live as God made them. Easy and free.
Still, there is an ideological difference between the pirates and the assassins, which is hinted at very early into the game.
Everything is permitted. I like the sound of that. Thinking what I like and acting how I please.
You parrot the words, but you do not understand.
Even before it's explicit though, the pirates just come off as less honorable than Altair, Ezio, or Connor did. Hornigold makes this point about Nassau.
Nassau may look fine from a distance, but at its core, there's a disease I cannot stomach.
And he's not exactly wrong. Nassau has a certain rugged charm to it, but it's also ugly, corrupt, and depraved. And the same can largely be said about its leaders. The game's cast of pirates have a similar swashbuckling, larger-than-life charm of characters you'd find in other pirate stories, but with an added touch of realism. They're, to a degree, very likable, but they're also sleazy, backstabbing, and filled with a poisoning sense of ambition and greed. While it's not always explicitly stated, the gap that exists between the assassins and the pirates is very apparent throughout the entire game. And then there's a character that bridges that gap, Edward Kenway. Black Flag does a masterful job in threading this needle between making Edward a definite, selfish anti-hero, while also making him a character the player wants to spend time with. Right in the first sequence, we see the full scope of his destructive self-centeredness. But we also get a glimpse at his main motivation for all his actions.
It's not about need, Caroline. I want food that don't make me sick. I want walls that hold back the wind. I want a decent life.
This simple desire for stability and comfort, for being
Man of quality,
goes a long way in humanizing Edward's selfishness. It doesn't justify any of his actions, but it does cast them in such a deeply personal light that it's hard not to root for him. It also helps that Edward is largely very likable. There's a lot of ways in which he's actually the antithesis to his fellow pirates. He's fiercely loyal to his companions, personable and kind to pretty much every face he meets, and is clearly bothered on some level by his own greed, even if he can't admit it. Now that doesn't mean that Nassau's and Edward's demises aren't still closely linked to each other. He still makes deals with the wrong people, ignores his conscience, and casts all his chips on a slim chance of finding wealth. And where does that all get him? Betrayed, broken, and alone. And remember, he's doing all this wearing an assassin's uniform. He believes their creed exonerates him to act as selfishly as he wants. He's gotta be wrong though, right? Black Flag's third act, while a bit rushed, also has some of the series' all-time best character moments. Edward Kenway has reached his lowest point. His pirate confederacy has now completely collapsed, along with his entire worldview. The voices that have been screaming at him all game to change course, to stand for something, are finally beginning to resonate with him. Now, this isn't an incredibly original redemption arc, but that doesn't mean it's not still very satisfying. Edward's downfall is almost excruciatingly drawn out throughout the bulk of the game's story. He is not a character eager for redemption. He hangs on to greed and ambition until he's got nothing left to hang on to. So, it's very, very cathartic to see him finally begin to listen to reason, and to stand for something beyond his own success. But what will he stand for? Hornigold foresaw the failure of pirate ideology long before Edward did, and he ended up joining the Templars, believing order and control to be the only way to build a productive society. Kenway takes a different route though. He's still a believer in freedom and individualism, and he's seen how tyrants can terrorize their subjects. So, he sides with the Brotherhood.
You would see all of mankind corralled into a neatly furnished prison, safe and sober, yet dulled beyond reason and sapped of all spirit. So with everything I've seen and learned in these last years, I do believe it.
Edward wants people to be free, adventurous, and proactive. He doesn't want to see people become slaves. But it's also not enough to be merely free, lest we become slaves of our own greed and ambition. What I get from his ideology is that a sense of responsibility must also accompany liberty. Now, this conversation is interesting, but it's also very abstract. It's in the game's final scene where we see this idea lived out. By this point, the AC series had defined itself by its spectacle. Its endings in particular always had this cinematic flair to them, constantly ending on climactic cliffhangers to build excitement for the next release. Now, there is nothing wrong with this type of ending. I mean, Revelations in particular has one of the most memorable conclusions I've ever seen in a video game. And we've seen how Black Flag is full of spectacle and drama. But its ending is laser focused on something else entirely. Something much more humble and complete. There is no climactic action set piece or cliffhanger. The soundtrack turns from excitement to melancholy as Sarah Green's beautiful rendition of The Parting Glass begins to play. And that adventurous sense of freedom, that freedom that the entire game world is built around, that the game celebrates and reveres and honors, it's left behind with the Caribbean. Even the freedom-fighting assassins, righteous as their cause is, are sidelined in the ending. All of this is cast aside in service of something greater. Edward bearing his responsibility and accepting his role as a father.
Oh, all the comrades that e'er I had, they're sorry for my going away, and all the sweethearts that e'er I've loved, they'd wish me one more day to stay.